Episode 1 of Raising Dion is arguably the worst episode of the series. With a smattering of hip-hop tracks and a fluttering tone between light and dark, Raising Dion does well to set the stage, but doesn't do a whole lot else. We begin with a mother narrating her trials and tribulations in raising her son Dion. In the heart of Atlanta at 7:15 a.m., we see Nicole preparing for school while Dion eats his breakfast. The house is a mess, and it's here Dion watches in awe as he seemingly controls time and suspends his cereal in midair. At 7:34 a.m., Dion manages to elevate rubbish either side of the road as Nicole drives him to school. When they get there, she sees firsthand that Dion is ignored by the other kids before hurrying back to her car, where she receives the bad news that she's been fired. Joking about Dion's skin color, telling her friends that he's like 2 raisins in a glass of milk, we cut back and forth from the school to Nicole's conversation with her friends as we see them both struggling. Desperate to fit in, Dion heads to the skate park as a slow-motion shot of him performing a skateboarding trick sees the other kids in awe until Nicole shows up and embarrasses him. Heading home, she sees Pat, his godfather, outside who offers to help her out. She reluctantly agrees as she breathes a deep sigh of relief and has a flashback involving her husband creating a Faraday cage. At the restaurant, Pat and Dion connect over comic books before the conversation turns to his father, where we learn, through a large dose of exposition, how good at science he was. Bringing Dion home after their dinner, Pat leaves before her son shows his powers firsthand. As items float and swirl around her, he loses control before everything eventually drops to the ground. Nicole decides to take him to hospital to get checked out, but after a fruitless visit, she heads back home, where we learn more about Dion's father, Mark. After watching a recorded video message, they decide to honor his memory and head down to the lake. It's here we also learn Nicole used to be a ballet dancer. While out on the lake, Dion attempts in vain to control his powers, changing from the wondrous levitating fish in water bubbles through to him being hit by a tree, as everything chaotically falls out of his control. In the middle of the night, Dion awakens to numerous ghostly spirits outside, rain people as he calls them. Mark's spirit appears soon after and tells Nicole to leave with Dion, where we leave the episode. Tonally, the first episode flits between serious drama and silly, playful comedy, and to be honest, it doesn't always work. There's also some pretty questionable special effects here too, with poor CGI on the skateboard as it floats through the air, accompanied by the bizarre choice of Gangster's Paradise. The music is another issue here too, and the constant hip-hop and R''N''B distracts from the drama. Thankfully, the ending should be enough to keep you coming back for more. Episode 2 of Raising Dion begins after the dramatic events during the night, as the sun rises and Nicole phones Charlotte Tuck, a woman who may know more about Mark's work. As she leaves a voicemail for her to phone back, it turns out Charlotte was listening the whole time. Detective Miller arrives soon after, asking about the storm and informing that a lady went missing by the lake. Telling her to phone if anything comes up, she leaves as Nicole phones Pat and tells him the news. Agreeing to help, Nicole hangs up and speaks to Dion about his powers in the morning. Distracted by a squirrel, it turns out Dion's powers are far more powerful than initially thought as he teleports to the top of a tree. Panicking, Dion's asthma flares up as Nicole scrambles for a ladder and helps him down. Offered a job at the hospital, Nicole reluctantly heads off while Dion leaves a note for his father, telling him they've gone home. At the store, Dion struggles to control his powers again, while Nicole is forced to buy an inhaler. Heading to her interview, Dion is advised by Kat to go home as her head isn't in the game, but is interrupted by the interviewer who invites her in. Midway through talking to Pat, Dion's battery dies, and he winds up spinning on his chair and levitating, forcing Nicole to end the interview abruptly and head home. Kat phones Pat and asks about Dion's behavior before we see Nicole baby-proofing the flat. Midway through, a knock at the door sees her neighbor arrive. Pat phones her soon after, where we learn more about Mark and Charlotte's shady past. It turns out she went radio silent the day Mark died. While Dion dons an outfit and a new persona, Mind Mover Esperanza arrives and heads in to see Dion. After a cute meeting together, she heads home while Dion plays his part and watches as Pat arrives and drops off dinner. Suddenly, Dion teleports outside and grabs a doll left in the middle of the road, only to almost get run over. However, he manages to teleport again at the last second into Nicole's arms as a shocked Pat watches on. With some good characterization and a more direct feel to proceedings, Raising Dion slowly starts to settle into its groove. Esperanza and Ian's cute meeting is a nice touch, and as more of Mark's shadowy past is uncovered, the more Raising Dion feels like a show that's starting to find its rhythm. Hopefully this can continue through the rest of the season. After showing off his powers to an excitable Pat, episode 3 of Raising Dion begins with Nicole taking offense to his enthusiasm. After Dion heads to bed, Nicole and Pat discuss his powers, where he tells her Dion needs something to control his abilities and stop him erratically losing his temper. In storage, she finds a watch and gives it to him in the morning as a way of channeling his emotions. Seemingly able to keep his abilities under control now, Dion heads back to school where he's teamed up with Esperanza for a school science project. After discussing his watch, the boys tease him and snatch it away, refusing to give it back. Losing his temper, Dion knocks the child into the wall with his powers before the teacher breaks up the fight, getting the wrong end of the stick and assuming Dion beat him down. After the initial school drama, Nicole receives a call from Charlotte. She tells her to meet at the swings in 20 minutes, prompting her to hurry off. While she drives to the scheduled location, Pat realizes his company BIONA may have more going on than he initially thought. Nicole makes it to the woods after walking from the swings alone, where she asks Charlotte about Dion's powers. It turns out Charlotte has powers of her own, as she suddenly appears before her. It's here we learn more about her invisibility, and also that Mark originally had powers too. It turns out Mark saved her from a storm, and as she relays the story about the spirits she saw during the freak storm the night before, it turns out something far more sinister is going on here. Wide-eyed and afraid, Charlotte disappears upon hearing this news, leaving Nicole alone. Pat picks up Dion from school and takes him to play basketball with Malik, encouraging him to use his powers in secret, whilst not letting the other boys catch on. After surprising everyone, he heads back home where Nicole shows up soon after and tells him about Charlotte and her abilities. Afterward, she speaks to Dion in bed about racism before tucking him in to say goodnight. Meanwhile, Charlotte sends her a picture of the thing inside the storm, which happens to be a giant electrified creature. With more backstory around the big antagonistic threat Dion will inevitably face, Raising Dion does well to set the stage for the conflict to come. While the series itself has struggled thus far to find an identity, this episode in particular does well to shake off the early cobwebs and start delivering something that feels a lot more fun and dramatic. As we approach the halfway point of the show, hopefully Raising Dion can build on this. Episode 4 of Raising Dion begins in Alabama with a father and son on a farm, surrounded by crops, while neighboring fields are dying and full of withered crops. After showing Pat the picture of the electrified giant, we learn it's Dion's birthday. Cat drops off an iPad as a present for the little man before Pat takes him out for a ride. Meanwhile, Malik is offered a job by Nicole to find the origin of the video. Along with a handsome sum of money, she also offers to teach him dance choreography. At BIONA, Pat shows Dion around before allowing Susanna to take him to the cafeteria while answering a call from Dion. Finally catching up to them, Susanna leaves as Dion hears the faint sound of a reindeer behind one of the locked doors. Managing to focus his powers, he swiftly levitates the keycard over to Pat and, deliberating what to do, decides to open the door and check what's inside. Along with a whole slew of animals, they also find a monitor showcasing a whole group of people being watched. Seeing a sick animal in one of the cages, Dion uses his powers to heal one of the cubs. After taking another animal from the cage, Dion drops the power in the lab and manages to sneak out with Pat, acting normally as they head out the building. On the way, they're stopped by security before stepping outside and seeing the blackout is actually nationwide and not just in the building. Heading home and notifying Nicole what happened, they discuss her dancing, while Suzanne demands her workers look through the CCTV and find out what happened. Walter, the man from the farm, then wakes up to find his son Brayden missing from the house. Outside, he watches as storm clouds gather. Telling his son to head inside, Walter uses his powers to protect the house, covering it in roots, while outside the storm man begins striking the land with lightning bolts. As the episode closes out, Brayden watches in horror as his father tries to fight off the giant. With a cliffhanger ending and a nice balance of drama and lighthearted elements, Raising Dion finally comes to life here in one of the series' best episodes. Seeing the organization hiding a whole array of creatures from Iceland and keeping track of, presumably, different superpowered individuals is a nice twist, and the whole series does well to keep things moving in a solid direction. Quite what's in store for our characters next remains to be seen, but right now that ending leaves things wide open. Episode 5 of Raising Dion begins in Iceland 2010. Mark joins Pat in a yurt full of scientific equipment and tells him he just got married to Nicole. They're here to record atmospheric conditions before and after the comet passes. Suddenly the sky changes color and multiple tiny shooting stars fall to the ground. Back to the present, it's the day of Dion's birthday party, and as he cheekily levitates a packet of crisps to his room, his mum tells him that some of his old friends aren't able to come. Nicole gets a call from her boss soon after, telling her to come to work, and, not able to refuse, she asks her neighbor Tessa to take him to the party for 3 p.m. Suzanne questions Pat about his whereabouts during the blackout and explains that 5 lira was vandalized. As Nicole heads to work, she reminisces about the past when she decided to quit dancing because she was pregnant. She told Mark just after a performance, and he vowed to be more present in his kid's life than his dad was in his. Back in the present, she unfortunately leaves work late and has to beg the closed bakery to let her in to get Dion's cake. We then flash back to 4 years ago when Mark started developing his powers. As he's missing his son's birthday party while investigating his abilities, he suddenly teleports there, and this makes him realize the extent of his powers. Back to the present, Dion is not having a great time as his old friends are making fun of him, and this makes him reject Esperanza's friendship to impress them. Angry, his mother berates him and tells him to apologize to her. As he angrily storms off to the bouncing castle, Dion makes his inhaler fly to him, prompting Esperanza to tell him she's known for a while that he has powers. Another flashback to New Orleans, in 2017 this time, shows Mark meeting Charlotte for the first time to talk about their abilities. She tells him to stop fighting it, and if he does that, he'll be able to control them. Just as she tells him that 2 other people from Iceland have disappeared, the storm man arrives, shooting bolts of lightning at them. Mark then rushes in to save a drowning Charlotte before being picked up by the giant. Screaming in agony, he disintegrates into thin air. In the present, the spirit of Mark watches his son sleep before disappearing into the night as the thunder claps. Dion then wakes up and sees the storm man outside. Hearing the storm herself, Nicole rushes in the room, and as she looks outside, she sees the outline of Mark in the clouds. This episode of Raising Dion gives us more backstory into Mark's past, and we finally see what happened that fateful day. This definitely helps move the story forward, but there are still some mysteries around his disappearance. Is it really his spirit that we have seen so far, or has he now taken a different form? There are still quite a lot of questions to answer, but in the meantime, Raising Dion offers us another decent episode full of suspense and action, making this series very easy to binge watch. Episode 6 of Raising Dion begins with Nicole and Dion talking about the night before during breakfast. When Dion arrives at school, he tells Esperanza all about the storm man from the night before. She suggests that since BIONA can track storms, they could also make them. Suddenly the class gets a message from Suzanne telling them that BIONA will be sponsoring this year's science fair. As Nicole heads into work, she hears that the dancers are rehearsing her old show and becomes nostalgic. While the theater is empty, Nicole decides to dance, not knowing that Rashid is watching her. This leads him to offer to train her during her lunch hour as he believes she should start dancing again. Back home, Dion tells his mum about the storm man, and as he shows her what he looks like, she shows him the picture on her phone, asking him if it's the same shape he saw. After confirming that it is, Nicole calls Charlotte and leaves a voicemail asking her to come to her house. At BIONA, Suzanne gives Pat access to 5 Lira labs and approval for his research proposal. She tells him that Mark was working on a confidential project, but since he disappeared, they haven't been able to find the results on his computer. The University of Iceland has since reported strange phenomena with the animals. After mentioning the healed fox, she also shows him land in Iceland slowly being destroyed. Charlotte appears in Nicole's house and tells her that the storm man is just too strong and there's nothing anyone can do. After convincing her to stay and help, Charlotte meets Dion and tells him that she will teach him to hide and use his powers. As they all head to the cellar, Dion and Charlotte show each other their respective powers. She then teaches him to be invisible while also trying to make control him his teleportation. While Dion works on his powers, Pat calls Nicole telling her he's now working in the famous lab. They later share a nice evening and spend some time together playing pool. After saying goodbye to each other, Nicole finds a memory card in Mark's watch containing the files of his Iceland project, and in one of the files, a list of names which they think might be the people who were in Iceland that fateful day. Meanwhile, we see that Suzanne has been sending a drone to spy on Nicole and Dion, where they end the episode. As we get closer to the finale, we are shown more of Dion's powers and they look to be quite impressive. Charlotte's lessons prove to be quite helpful, and it has been really fun watching both of them bond over their common powers. Esperanza plays her part so well and really steals the show whenever she's on screen too with her humor and sharp wit. Who knows, maybe we may even find out she has powers too? One thing's for sure though, as Dion becomes more attuned to his impressive powers, the finale looks set to be pretty exciting and full of action. Episode 7 of Raising Dion sees Charlotte travel to the farm in Alabama and sees the same burn marks on the floor as the ones we've seen in Iceland. Suddenly Brayden appears and asks her if she's like her dad, telling her to come with him. Pat arrives at Nicole's house and after some initial awkwardness, Nicole shows him what she found in Mark's files. He suggests taking it to work to analyze, but she tells him she doesn't trust BIONA, and neither did Mark according to his notes. On his way to school, Pat tells Dion that the fox is now healed. He goes on to complains about his migraine, so Dion tries to use his powers to make it go away. This unfortunately gives him a fever as he had to use a lot of power. His mum gets a call from the school, but she's unable to pick him up. She asks Kat to get him instead, and when she sees how ill he is, she takes him to hospital. As they try to cool him off with ice, they see that it melts within seconds. Meanwhile, Charlotte speaks with Brayden's aunt, who tells her that her brother wasn't the same after the meteor shower and thinks he was worshipping the devil. Brayden then starts to communicate with Charlotte telepathically. They both meet in the garden, and Brayden explains what his dad did to protect him from the storm man. He asks her to take him with her, but she refuses, telling him she's unable to. In the hospital, Nicole asks to take Dion home, but Kat stops her, still not believing that he has powers, prompting Pat to come over and explain the reason why Dion is sick. As he leaves to try finding out more about Mark's experiments, Kat comes back in the room and sees her nephew levitating. Finally believing her, Kat decides to go and delete Dion's medical records, which causes a rift between Kat and her girlfriend. Suddenly, Dion takes a turn for the worst, leaving Kat scrambling to make him better. Pat arrives and explains that after looking at Mark's research, Dion needs more iodine. Kat quickly puts more iodine in his IV, and finally, Dion gets better. While Dion is in the toilet, Pat discusses their situation with Nicole to see where they stand. She tells him she wants them to stay friends. As they leave the hospital, they're stopped by men in hazmat suits claiming to be from the CDC and demanding they put Dion in quarantine. Ignoring Nicole's protests, they take Dion away in a van, but as they close the door, we see that they are actually from BIONA, where we leave the episode. This latest episode of Raising Dion shows BIONA becoming a bigger threat. As they're now aware of Dion's power and he's within their grasp, things are looking bleak for the mother and son duo. Raising Dion continues to build enough tension and action to make it enjoyable, but whether all the questions will be answered at the end or leave this one hanging on a cliffhanger remains to be seen. Episode 8 of Raising Dion begins with Nicole bursting into BIONA, shouting and demanding to see her son. After breaking a window, Suzanne arrives and brings her to her office. There, she explains what they know about Dion and the unexplained phenomena surrounding the microstorms. She goes on to explain that they want to study Dion as they believe he's linked to the storms. Nicole protests and offers to give them Mark's research notes in exchange for them releasing Dion. Suzanne accepts, and after they leave BIONA, she gives all of Mark's data to Pat. After studying it all, he explains that Dion is using his powers too much, and it poses a threat to him. The next day, Charlotte visits Nicole and relays what happened with Walter and Brayden before Pat arrives to check in on Dion. He explains that he's going through all the data and that Suzanne believes Dion might be the solution to reverse the necrosis of the land in Iceland. Dion insists on going to school instead, but his mum only agrees to it if Charlotte will be with him the whole time, invisible. In the evening, as Charlotte and Nicole look through the BIONA storm data, they come to the conclusion that each person present during the Aurora event vanished on the same day and place as one of the storms. While Dion is working on his storm science project with Esperanza and Jonathan, Nicole continues getting lessons from Rashid. Just as they share an intimate dance, Pat arrives and witnesses the two growing closer. At school, the three kids are almost finished with their project, The Storm Killer. However, Jonathan decides to ditch them for his other friends, leaving Esperanza to complete it. Dion then decides to use his power to make her fly, thinking that she would like it. However, she gets upset and make him stop. Pat confronts Nicole about the situation soon after, telling her he feels like she's been taking advantage of him, and asks if she's seeing Rashid. She apologizes that he feels that way, and as things escalate, Nicole gets angry with him, telling Pat they should take a break and he shouldn't pick up Dion from school. After Charlotte takes Dion home instead, she sees Pat lurking around. She confronts him and tells him that Nicole doesn't want him around. However, he suddenly turns around and tells her that he should have killed her in New Orleans. It's here we see the horrifying truth: Pat is the storm man. Nicole receives a call from Suzanne soon after, telling her there's a storm forming outside her house. As she arrives, she sees the storm man attacking Charlotte and picking her up, just like he did with Mark. As we reach the end of this penultimate episode of Raising Dion, we are given a shocking twist with the revelation that Pat is the storm man. I have to admit, I really didn't see it coming. There are still a lot of questions left to be answered here though, and hopefully these answers will be given with the finale. Things aren't looking good for Charlotte either, which is a shame as she has become one of my favorite characters here. Still, the finale is up next, and it promises to be a pretty dramatic one, but whether it leaves things open for a second or not, remains to be seen. The season finale of Raising Dion begins in Iceland 2010 during the Aurora event. As Mark witnesses the solar flares, he heads outside but is hit by some of the falling debris. 4 years later in Atlanta, Pat's girlfriend Carrie tells him she wants to break up as he's been coming on too strong lately. As she leaves, Pat tries to stop her, which causes her to demonstrate her fire powers. This leads to Pat's powers manifesting themselves for the first time too, making him the Storm Man. We then flash forward to the present time, where we see Charlotte disappearing in the Storm Man, just like Mark did. After witnessing this, Nicole rushes in the house and tells Dion they need to leave. After they do, Pat returns to his normal self and starts looking for them. This leads him to Kat, who, after pleading with her, reveals that Nicole has gone to her parents'. However, this happens to be a lie as they've actually gone to the cabin. Sensing foul play, Pat then messages Dion and finds out where they really are. Reaching the cabin, he forces his way in and after pushing Nicole out the way, Dion manages to teleport to the community center. Pat turns around and tells Nicole that all he wanted is for them to be a family. Nicole hits him in the back of the head, prompting him to change to the Storm Man and leave the cabin in an explosion of smoke. We then flash back to the day Nicole and Mark met at college, before returning to the present day where we see Dion joining his two friends in the science fair, apologizing to them. A panicking Nicole calls Suzanne, telling her Pat is the Storm Man, and begs her for help keeping Dion safe. We then cut to Pat appearing at the science fair where he attempts to take Dion away. He manages to convince Dion to heal him, just as Nicole arrives to tell Dion everything. After tricking him into thinking he was healing, they manage to run away, but Pat, as the storm man, soon comes after them. Meanwhile, BIONA arrives with 2 trucks, ready to attempt cooling down the storm with liquid nitrogen, just like in Dion's school project. As Dion uses his powers against him, we see the smoke spirit of his dad escaping its prison. Suddenly his mum throws a metal rod into the storm man's chest, prompting Dion to aim his power there. This then gets rid of the monster for now, before we see Mark reuniting temporarily with his family. He tells them that the threat is still out there and apologizes to his wife before disappearing. As they try to go back to their normal life, Nicole vows that whatever threat remains, it will have to go through her first. The episode then ends at the Alabama farm where we see the land slowly dying and Brayden becoming the new storm man. The finale of Raising Dion was, as expected, very tense and full of action. Seeing BIONA and our ragtag group of survivors teaming up to defeat the Storm Man was a nice touch, especially as we realize that the company is not as evil as we thought. The kids really have some good chemistry together, but it's Esperanza who stands out and creates some funny and touching scenes throughout the series. While some of the questions remain unanswered, the finale was still enjoyable nonetheless. It does end on a cliffhanger though, just like many other Netflix shows do, but it was quite a good twist nonetheless. Who knows what will happen to the world now, and if a second season is greenlit, I'd imagine we'll see a big showdown between the two kids. Perhaps a second season could offer more explanation behind everyone's powers too, but in the meantime, Raising Dion has been a decent series and a nice easy watch through.